This is Glenn Loury at Brown University and bloggingheads.tv, The Glenn Show. Welcome to The Glenn Show, Rajiv. You were a recent guest on The Glenn Show when we discussed this book, Capital in the 21st Century of Thomas Piketty. And I'm really glad to have you back as an interlocutor.
Oh, it's a pleasure for me to be back, Glenn.
Good, good. So let me just take a moment to introduce our conversation. Actually, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'll turn the chair over to you because you have wanted to interview me on the subject of political correctness. And I'll just tell our viewers that 20 years ago, I published a paper in the journal Rationality and Society called Self-censorship and Public Discourse, a Theory of Political Correctness and Related Phenomena. And bless your heart, you admire that paper and you thought it worthy of a conversation at Blogging Heads, and I agree. And then I'll just take one more moment here before turning it over to you to introduce you to our audience. As I said, we did a previous conversation on the book by this French economist, and it was our conversation very well received. You are a professor at Barnard College at Columbia University of Economics, a well-published microeconomic theorist, applied microeconomic theory, I would say. And with broad interest, I remember learning really about the significance of agent-based modeling from you. You are an external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, which has a social science research initiative that is organized around thinking outside the box on questions of economic change, dynamics, fundamentals, and whatnot. I know you write about financial economics, but you and I have come to be friends and colleagues through our common interest in social economics. And you published influential papers in the top economics journals on questions of stereotypes and discrimination and inequality. We've co-authored, we have co-taught together a little small summer institute at the University of the Andes in Bogota. And we have published a paper together. So anyway, forgive me for going on too long to just simply introduce you to the viewership at The Glenn Show. And we're going to talk political correctness, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, Rajiv, to lead the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. So I'm obviously very familiar with your body of work going back to your dissertation in the 70s. But really, of all the papers, and you've written a bunch of very influential papers, but of all the papers that you've done, one of my absolute favorites is this one that we're going to discuss today, not just in the abstract, but also in relation to certain conversations that have been going on recently in the United States. And this is this paper on self-censorship in public discourse, as you mentioned in Rationality and Society in 1994. And it's an extraordinary paper. It's one of my favorite papers that's written by an economist. I don't even really consider it an economics paper, but it's clearly written by an economist, and it could only really have been written by an economist. I think, although it mentions, it draws upon the work of folk people like Albert Hirschman, the sociologist Irving Goffman, draws on Shakespeare, draws on Orwell. But it also draws on a literature in economics that's really descended from a classic econometrica paper by Crawford and Sobel on what are called sender-receiver games. A game theoretic analysis of information transmission or strategic information transmission, and you weave these different themes together in this paper in a wonderful way. And I hope that if this conversation stimulates some folks to go back and read that paper, it'll be a wonderful thing.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's accessible. It's very clearly written, very precise, but also accessible to the layperson. So I'm just before we start talking about it, I just want to make a plug for it for a general reader.
Can I say just one little small word here? It's your show, but thank you so much for your kind words about my paper. I'm so proud of that paper. It was inspired by Albert Hirschman and Thomas Schelling.
Yeah.
Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, the reading of which was, like a profound intellectual event for me in the early 1980s is when I read that book. And Thomas Schelling, who was my colleague he's a master of strategic analysis, The Strategy of Conflict, his great book from 1960, if I'm not mistaken, a Nobel laureate 2005, Thomas Schelling, who was my friend and colleague at Harvard for so many years, and who inspired me as I was complaining about the burdens of political correctness back in the 1980s and early 1990s when I was, a kind of neoconservative African American and so out in the wilderness and, such, to think strategically,
Yeah.
I mean, that paper, and I say so in the acknowledgement, would never have been written without Tom's insistent kind of encouragement and pushing me to do it. And I'm so proud that it is a piece of writing. It's a piece, in the small L, literature, I mean, I'm trying to express ideas in a way that doesn't get, reduced down to a formula, that's aware of the kind of subtleties and the kind of, ambiguities and, open-endedness of these things. And there's no reason why economists can't bring our apparatus of green eye shade analytics to bear in the sort of moral philosophic territory, which I was exploring in that paper. Okay, so thank you for allowing me to make that comment.
That's right. In fact, the style of the writing is similar to Schelling's own in Strategy of Conflict and also in Micromotives and Microbehavior. And it reminded me that you dedicated, if I'm not mistaken, your Du Bois lectures, the Anatomy of Racial Inequality, to Schelling also. Is that right, or am I not remembering?
That's right. That book is dedicated to Thomas Schelling, mentor, colleague, and friend, whose example I strive to emulate. I'm pretty sure that's a quote of the dedication. That book, 2002.
Yeah.
But very much motivated and inspired by my collaboration with Thomas Schelling in the 1980s at the Kennedy School when we launched a course called Public Policy in Divided Societies. And where I really, I was kind of in despair in those years because my dissertation had been about race and inequality. I rather fancied myself to be a mathematical economist and a theorist. Mm-hmm. I was at Northwestern University in those years, 1976, 7, 8, 9, kind of the creation, the birth of incentive compatibility and some of the fundamental social choice things, people like Bengt Holmstrom and Paul Milgram and Eric Maskin and Roger Meyerson and Leonid Hurwitz and all that. I mean, I really thought of myself as a theorist in the old school hardcore sense.
Yes.
But I was so passionately interested in these questions of history and justice, culture, race, inequality in American society. And I felt like I was in a box, that there was no way to be both. Okay. And Tom really showed me by example and, inspiration and just friendship and companionship that it was really possible to be an intellectual and to have a kind of broad view and to have an engagement and a kind of, not straitjacketed and blinkered intellectual imagination, and yet also to not abandon economics, to be nurtured by and empowered by the analytical apparatus of economics. And I think that's where, quote, the truth lies.
I think that's right.
So. But that's that. Okay, enough about me until we start talking about me again.
No, let's move on to the substance of the paper then.
Yeah.
And we can talk a little bit about the context in which you wrote it and the history. But the basic idea, so I'm going to try to paraphrase it and then you can fill in the gaps and correct me if I'm mistaken. But the basic idea is that that when we speak, so when one person communicates with another or communicates with an audience, they are trying to convey an impression. They are not simply trying to transfer information. That that the speaker holds certain values and deep commitments, and the listener is alert to this and seeks to discern these values and commitments. And what can happen is that the words themselves end up not being interpreted in a sort of literal or naive way, which can cause people with some set of commitments to simply abstain from using certain kinds of language or certain kinds of modes of expression, or even communicating certain types of content. So the basic idea is that if let's just keeping it abstract for just a second, if a certain type of speech or a certain expression of content is likely to come from somebody holding extreme views or holding certain types of moral commitments and values that moderates do not share, then somebody who is a moderate, even if they agreed with that particular content would abstain from expressing it, because then they would be attributed to be extreme, that they would reveal themselves to be something that they are not. Is that part of the argument that you're making here in this paper?
That's the core of the argument. You said it very well. That's exactly the idea. The idea is that speech, political communication that's open and that everyone can hear, is visible and easily verifiable. He said it. We know that he said that. But values, that is, what are the deeper commitments and, kind of fundamental positions of a person? What do they believe in? What would they fight and die for? What do they affirm? Mm. These things are very hard to know about an individual. They are not visible. And that there's a tendency for people to link the one to the other. They take the one as a, quote, signal, close quote, of the other, which this idea of signaling has been developed in other contexts in economic theory, in the study of situations where there's asymmetry of information. Some parties have more information than others. The actions they take may reveal that information. Right. They are aware of that possibility. The people who see their actions are aware of that possibility, and so on. And one has a game structure there, as you know very well, that one can analyze. So I was taking that kind of idea. Speech is visible. It becomes a signal of the value of the person. And then observing that to the extent that people with very readily knowable and strongly held values that are kind of badges of identity, the Communist Party membership or whatever, mm-hmm. are prepared to speak in a certain way. If people who don't hold those fundamental beliefs know that people who hear the speech may presume that the speaker holds those beliefs, they will be disinclined to speak in that way for not wanting to be tainted by that identification. Right. But to that very extent, the fact of speaking in that way will become emblematic of being a member of the Communist Party or whatever the stigmatized value is, so that an arena is created then where speech is limited. I mean, expressions of certain character becoming identified with certain value positions are abandoned by people who don't hold those positions, even if they might be prepared to speak in ways that are similar to the speech of people who do hold those positions. Again, I went on too long, but you did do a very good job, I think, of summarizing the core idea. Right. That's the driving intellectual engine of that entire paper.
Right. So perhaps we could illustrate it with a couple of examples.
Good.
So would it be fair to say, let's take a hypothetical example. Suppose that it were the case that, if we think about the current conflict going on in the Middle East, suppose it were the case that people who publicly expressed views that were critical of Israel were believed to be largely anti-Semitic, so that when people heard those views expressed, they would assume that the speaker was anti-Semitic.
Right.
Now, if you put yourself in a position of somebody who is critical of Israel but not anti-Semitic, who cares deeply about not being mistakenly thought to be anti-Semitic,
right.
That person may self-censor, to use your term. They may decide not to express views that are critical of Israel because they fear the attribution that they actually hold certain deep commitments or certain moral positions that they actually do not hold, and that they would like to resist being assigned to them. Does that example fit the basic theory in the paper?
Well, indeed it does. That example, that generally area of discussion, that is how the war, this is Israel and Gaza, the Hamas, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and now most recently flared up in this war that seems as we speak to be entering a period of quiet, but has been very violent with many hundreds of casualties on the Palestinian side and scores of casualties on the Israeli side, and so on and so on. But in any case, how it's discussed, what people can say about it, how they position and what they, do they take sides, can they have a comment, and so on. And yes, that's one dimension of the political correctness, which is to say limitations on the expression of one's opinion for fear of being wrongly thought of, in which that phenomenon manifests itself as this anti-Semitism thing that you say, which is if I am critical of Israel, or more generally, if I'm anti-Zionist, if I'm not necessarily 100% full bore behind this idea of the Jewish state, the homeland of the Jewish people, the legitimacy of the events of 1947-48, the kind of, if I tend to sympathize with the Palestinians, if I think there's a question about the, neo-colonial aspects of the Zionist successes in creating the state of Israel and dispossessing the Palestinian people. If I talk in those terms, people will think me to be an anti-Semite. I don't want to be an anti-Semite, and there's one thing for sure, the anti-Semites of the world, and we could list candidates here, from Paris to Tehran, we could list the candidates. The anti-Semites of the world talk precisely in this way. I don't want to be identified with them. And there are all these phenomena that will then crop up. For example, the disclaimer. The person who, before criticizing, I don't know what, the bombing of a hospital or the killing of civilians as collateral damage in a strike undertaken by the Israeli Defense Force, before expressing their sympathy with the Palestinians, they will acknowledge, Israel's right to exist, quote unquote. They will acknowledge Israel's right to self-defense, quote unquote. They will acknowledge Israel's only democracy in the Middle East, quote unquote. They will affirm Israel closest ally to the United States, quote unquote. These formulaic, could be given numbers, and instead of saying the sentences number 6, number 3, number 2, expressions of sympathy for alignment with whatever, the state of Israel, all postures designed to deflect the inference that the sentence about to come, the sentence which says the bombing of the hospital or whatever was unacceptable, inhumane, excessive, disproportionate criminality, or whatever the sentiment might be, to protect the speaker of that sentiment from the inference that they are an anti-Semite. And the consequence of this, and this is one of the reasons why I found myself drawn to Orwell, Politics and the English Language. Anyone who hasn't read that essay should read it, about the damage done to clear speaking and the conveying of meaningful exchange of political opinion by the imperative of presenting oneself in an acceptable light to a readership. They're all on display in the contorted, hypocritical, self-contradictory, vague and obscurantist ways in which people talk about this conflict, but also about many other issues.
Right. So I just want to probe a little bit the sort of analytical foundations of what you developed here. So you have this idea of an equilibrium. So what we mean by an equilibrium, in the sense of Crawford and Sobel, whom I mentioned before, is that the speaker will make a choice about what to communicate and exactly how to communicate, and the receiver of that information, or the audience, will interpret that in a way that they'll form impressions about the moral commitments, let's say, of the speaker, which are accurate in equilibrium. So accurate in equilibrium means that the receiver correctly interprets in a Bayesian sense. This is why I said it's clearly a paper written by an economist. Interprets correctly the signals that are being transmitted by the sender, and the sender perfectly anticipates the manner in which those signals, those messages, are going to be interpreted. So, just to complete the example, then, if it is the case that certain kinds of messages are going to be sent only by or largely by people who are anti-Semitic, and the audience understands this, then those who are not anti-Semitic will not submit the same messages because they don't want to be lumped in, they don't want to be perceived to be anti-Semitic. And this is an equilibrium. It's an equilibrium because the people who are truly anti-Semitic don't really care about being thought as such, whereas those who are not do care. And what that does, to use terms that you use in this paper, is that it impoverishes our public discourse, because what it does is it causes certain kinds of people to remain silent, and that's a self-fulfilling phenomenon. We're stuck in a sort of a kind of a communication trap here, because no individual wants to speak in a manner that is associated with people very, very different from themselves, because they don't want to be lumped in with those people. That notion of equilibrium, am I describing correctly the way in which...
Oh my God, you asked me. You're describing brilliantly, and I almost want to thank God for you. I mean, in the sense that you put your finger on the very thing that makes bringing all of the heavy apparatus of economic theory to bear on this problem
right.
worth doing. This is the core insight here, and this is really Michael Spence's insight, as
Yes.
you know.
Yes, yes.
That's why he was included in that Nobel Prize that was awarded to George Akerlof and Joseph Stiglitz
Correct.
and Michael Spence, because this is a bedrock insight
Yes.
from the early 1970s in the development of the economics of information. The insight being, what makes signaling work is a certain empirical regularity.
Right.
Okay? That regularity being that, and let's stay within the example and not be too abstract, the cost of the sanction for illegitimate speech weighs more heavily on the people who are not the types who would engage in the illegitimate speech.
That's right.
Okay? So in the example, we have anti-Semites. Let's suppose the world consists of people who are or are not anti-Semitic. We have anti-Semites who are always going to find fault with the Israeli Defense Forces and will always accuse Israel of having killed and having been illegitimate, whatever. And then you have the ones who are not anti-Semites who may, on a particular occasion, come to the conclusion that Israel has overstepped, but may not be willing to say so for fear of being thought anti-Semitic. Well, that's because if they say so and are thought anti-Semitic, there will be a sanction, and that sanction is painful to them. It needs to be the case that whatever that sanction is, being anti-Semitic makes it less painful, so that, quote, in the equilibrium, as we economists would say, close quote,
Yeah.
the presumption that a speaker who says Israel behaved badly in Gaza is anti-Semitic is an accurate presumption, because only the people who actually are anti-Semitic are willing to say it, which is to say, are willing to bear the cost of the forthcoming sanction from having said it.
Yeah.
This correlation between sociability and co-belief. Okay?
Right.
That is to say, between not wanting to be ostracized, the pain of being ostracized, and not being on the wrong side of the issue, not being truly anti-Semitic. The correlation between the two. Anti-Semitics find the ostracism coming from being viewed as anti-Semitic less costly than people who are not anti-Semitic. This empirical presumption is a necessary condition for the phenomenon of political correctness, as I conceive it, to emerge in equilibrium. And this idea of constraining what we predict to be the outcome from social interaction to those patterns that can be sustained and replicated in equilibrium, this is a core, sort of organizing idea from economics, which helps us understand social behavior more broadly.
Yes. I'd like to come back to this point, but one thing that's not really explored in your paper, which I think might be worth exploring in future work by us or by anybody else, is that we understand that an equilibrium is a situation in which no individual through unilateral action can cause a situation to change. But we also understand that there are situations in which we have multiple equilibria. You have got your own work with Stephen Coate on the possibility of multiple equilibria in labor markets. But could there be in this context or in related contexts also the possibility of multiple equilibria, that if a large number of people who don't share a particular set of moral commitments, who as individuals are fearful to speak out and express their views on the matter, were to somehow collectively manage to do so, that could result in a very different equilibrium. We could have an equilibrium in which the things that are being expressed are really, really quite different, but are also self-fulfilling. And the problem is reaching one equilibrium from the other. We're stuck in a state, not because that's the only state in which we could be stuck, but because history has somehow brought us to that state, and it's very hard to dislodge.
Oh, this is so correct. And listeners out there who did not take Economics 601, the graduate course in microeconomic theory, please don't stop listening. No, this is so spot on. Okay, so the phenomenon of the emperor has no clothes. Okay, that's a excuse me. Just a moment. That's an allegory, a fairy tale about a circumstance in which everyone can see the emperor is naked. He's been deceived by his charlatan tailors that he's got the latest. Apparently, you can't see the clothes, but they're really beautiful clothes there, costume. And so he ventures out and he has no clothes on. No one dares to say it. No one wants to be on the wrong side of the emperor. If most of the crowd are thinking the emperor is fully well clothed, what's the problem? No one wants to be the one saying, oh, he's naked, he's naked. But everyone can see he's naked. And they're all in this, quote, equilibrium, close quote, in which they fear, each of them, individually, given that the 99.9% are sitting there saying nothing, to be the lone person to say so. So no one says anything, and the emperor prances on. Mm-hmm. Until some kid steps into the model, steps into the circumstance, unaware of the social conformity expectations and requirements that have sustained this equilibrium, in which the kid, therefore, doesn't anticipate and doesn't fear the social sanction cost of being the only one to speak. He said, the emperor's naked. And he says it, and everyone hears him says it, and more importantly, everyone hears that everyone hears him say it.
Right.
Okay? And maybe, perhaps now, people, as they put their hands to their mouths, gasping at the nakedness of the emperor, and each of them sees the others doing, and it comes to be a majority of them, and others begin to murmur, and then the next thing you know, the whole crowd is set upon the emperor. How dare you come out in your underwear and you're naked? It's ridiculous. And so we're in a new equilibrium in which there's no foreclosure of observation about the nakedness of the emperor. Right. Precisely. Right. That idea, again, an idea that comes right out of the engine of economic analysis that we're using here, and an idea that justifies the somewhat abstract way of formulating the problem. Right. Is I think another product of this, of framing it in this way. I think it is an insight. I think it does explain some of what we see.
I think it does. It also allows us to imagine alternative worlds that don't exist but could exist, and that are equally consistent with the deeper values and judgments that we hold. It's an equilibrium in which very different things are expressed in the public sphere, but without any real change in the way in which people feel on specific issues, but simply because a certain small group doesn't dominate the expression of a particular position. Others feel free to join in. They're not stereotyped quite so easily, and so you end up with a very different equilibrium. I think the usefulness of economic analysis here is in saying that is in showing that the world we live in terms of the nature of what gets discussed and how it gets spoken about in the public sphere, is not simply a reflection of what people believe, but rather also a reflection of what they believe those who are like themselves will say in public. And so I don't want to get too deep into economic analysis here, but I think that there is an insight there that's quite important to convey. But this takes me to a related point, which is your idea in the paper of what you call standing or natural cover. So an individual. So many of the examples in the paper, as well as in your work more broadly, have to do with race in the United States and the way we speak about race in the United States. In the paper itself, you talked about affirmative action. You talked about sanctions against the South African regime at that time, the apartheid regime, and in such situations, if somebody's visible attributes, so for example, whether an audience will view them as being black or white, can affect, again, to use a Bayesian term, their prior about what they believe. So if you have a prejudgment that a person holds certain views, that can give them natural cover to express views that are atypical. So maybe you can expand on this. So the basic idea is that somebody can express views if they are black that they could not express if they were white, or vice versa, because they have standing or natural cover on certain sets of issues, because their moral commitments are presumed to be one way rather than another. Can you expand on this a bit?
Yes, of course. I'm happy to do so. Thanks for asking. I mean, this occurs within the context, having set up this general model of speech being a signaling device that allows listeners to infer something about the unobserved moral position of speakers, and that can lead to speakers who do not have a certain unpopular moral position, being unwilling to speak in a certain way for fear of being thought that they do. Having set out that general model, I then consider some applications and implications of the model. And one of the applications is to environments of what I call multiple audience, where there are different categorical groups out in the society. For example, racial or gender or nationality groups. And if you're black and you're a speaker, the idea of being thought that you're a racist, you kind of have natural cover from that inference. I mean, the first thought will not be that you're a racist. If you're Jewish or Israeli and you have a view, about the war, the occupation or whatever, the idea that you're anti-Semitic will, perhaps it's possible you could be a self-hating, quote unquote, self-hating Jew or a self-hating black, but it at least is not as readily available for a listener's inference that you would be so. So that I was trying to consider what could come about in a world in which there were these different audiences. And this is interesting from both the speaker and the listener's point of view. So, for example, with multiple audience, there might be like dog whistle speech. You know what I mean? I'm trying to talk to the segregationists, but I know everyone can hear me. So I say states' rights forever. But what I really mean is no Negroes need apply. But I can't quite say that. But the Southerners get that this is what I'm saying from the fact that I put it that way. And I have plausible deniability from the rest of the society that I didn't quite mean it that way. And you get this phenomenon of insiders. So we're going to criticize a group, or we're going to say something that would be controversial about the group, which if said by people outside the group would be unacceptable, would be an indication of racism, anti-Semitism, anti-patriotism, or so on. But which, when said by someone inside the group, becomes less easily to be dismissed with that ad hominem imputation. The speaker is against our group. Well, no, the speaker is a native of our group and nevertheless speaks in this way. And so that too was something that I was interested in exploring, the fact that insiders might have natural cover and that could create very interesting moral dilemmas for insiders, who might see the fact that their group's behavior, let's say an Israeli who thinks that the occupation or the prosecution of the conflict is morally problematic in the extreme. Does he speak or she out? Do they speak out their view, risking ostracism within their group, risking being accused of being a traitor, being exploited by the other side with whom they don't have 100% co-alignment of interest, but who would point to them? You see, even Jews are saying, even blacks are willing to, kind of argument, and then they become the instrument of that. And so they face a dilemma. If I just may conclude this overly long response to you by saying, I was much influenced by Michael Walzer, the political philosopher Michael Walzer, whose books about social criticism published in the 1990s, A Company of Critics, which is a collection of essays examining the writing of people like Orwell and Camus and others, but also his book, Interpretation and Social Criticism, which is a small theoretical book about the functioning of social critics. Walzer had a big influence on me because this insider critic dilemma, people go into exile, they leave their homelands and they go off because they have views that are not acceptable by their fellows and they're ostracized. And Walzer has this, I think, very, persuasive argument about the imperative of staying connected. That is, even if you're going to be in the wilderness, you must stay connected, and that something about the power and the kind of resonant truth of your criticism depends upon that connectedness, even though you pay this enormous price as a martyred individual for being thought to be self-hating or Uncle Tomish or whatever it might be. Again, enough from me, but yes, precisely, multiple audiences, natural cover, those kind of ideas emerge from the core argument from my essay.
So one consequence of this is, and you explored this in the paper, is that disagreement about an issue can be much more vigorous when it's purely internal. So if a group of individuals who share an identity and who are convinced of each other's sort of moral commitments to the same values, they can disagree quite aggressively and quite have a vibrant debates and discussions about a topic which they could not do in mixed company. And the reason they couldn't do it in mixed company is because certain types of arguments could then be used by those who don't share those moral commitments to make arguments that would not further the welfare of the group. That would be positively harmful to the welfare of the group. This is also one of the arguments that you make there. Is that right?
No, that's absolutely right. A nice point. I won't speak long here, but it should be underscored. This is the kind of richness and resonance of the deliberation. So disagreement, argument, people bring facts, they bring opinion, they have values, what do they imply? They have different analyses, different conclusions, and they argue. And in a context in which it's shrouded with this sense of, I don't want to step to the wrong side of a line, I don't want to be thought, I'll say this, but I don't want you to think I'm anti-black. I have these deep questions about affirmative action, or I'm really afraid of criminals in the city to disproportionately, whatever, but I can't quite say. When the blacks get into the church basement amongst themselves and they start talking about, I'm a homeowner and, they're prostitutes plying their trade on the corner, or open air drug markets around and I can't, the violence where I'm afraid, It's one thing as a kind of open discussion to talk about the fear of the black criminal, quote unquote, black criminal. It's another thing in a church basement amongst black people who are being victimized by, quote unquote, the black criminal to talk in that way. And you will hear them talking in a much more full-throated and sharply worded, and it has points. I mean, they're not blunting their sentences with qualification and disclaimer.
Yeah.
They're cutting right to the core of the problem, and they can openly disagree. And again, as you say, no one thinks that the fact of disagreement is symptomatic of a deeper opposition to core values that people regard as defining of decency within their community. So yes, these internal arguments within Israel about the occupation or the way in which the Israeli government and security forces pursue their imperative to defend the country. These internal agreements will be much more vigorous. One would find a much more extensive argumentation than the pablum that you get in the American press, where every elected official has to begin their statement with, I defend the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state.
So just thinking further along these lines, if one of the most powerful sort of rhetorical devices that one can use, thinking about, let's say, political parties, for instance, where one's identity is tied up with one's political party, people are very concerned about heretics or traitors or turncoats, or people who might deflect and join the opposing party, and this itself can also be a force that silences moderation. So I'm thinking, people like Arlen Specter and Charlie Crist are people who have sort of
the liberal Republican,
the liberal Republicans plus the conservative Democrats. You have this thing going both ways, and the most powerful argument that one could make against another party would be if some member of that very same party was making the criticism that you are trying to make. Which causes people to police speech within their own group in kind of extreme ways. So just to take a couple of examples, if certain things are expressed, let's say on talk radio or on extreme fringes of the national dialogue, for example, about President Obama being born in Kenya, let's say. Or talk about impeachment, or talk about a lawsuit, or so on and so forth. If these kind of statements are expressed, and those who do not share them but who belong to the party are called upon to deny them or to condemn them.
Yes.
They may they may well condemn them privately. They may well find them embarrassing, but they may face incentives not to condemn them in public, because that might convey to the audience of insiders that they somehow don't share the same values and moral commitments as other group members, or in this case, other party members.
Do you remember, exactly, you're quite right, and again, it deserves to be underscored, and again, I won't speak long, but I do want to underscore, do you remember the moment during the 2008 Democratic primary contest between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton?
Yes.
Where she, desperate, it was toward the end, they had 4 debates or whatever they had, I can't remember, but she, desperate now because things had turned against her campaign, and people were beginning to call for her to get out of the campaign, pressed Obama about the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, do you denounce and do you repudiate? I can't remember what the two words were.
Yeah.
But she was urging him to do so, and he said, in effect, I denounce and I repudiate.
Yeah.
Okay?
I do remember.
So it's supposed to have created a dilemma for him, this demand for denunciation, which more generally is this idea, you're a Republican, you're supposed to be a moderate. Do you denounce the Tea Partiers who don't want to do anything with Obama? Do you denounce the immigration reformist extremists who are, do you denounce the anti-feminists who have said something stupid about women? Do you denounce?
Mm.
And so you confront the Republican candidate with this kind of, impossible choice between either infuriating the extreme members of his party by alienating them, by disassociating himself from them, or seeming to embrace the views of the extreme member of the party by being unwilling to denounce them.
Yeah, but this gives the extreme members of both parties or multiple parties, if there are such, an outsized voice in the public discourse. So
it does. It gives them, many examples of this from my youth. The minister Louis Farrakhan, head of the Nation of Islam, as it has descended to the present day from its roots with its founding Honorable Elijah Muhammad. These are the black Muslims. And so he's an anti-Semite. So he said these things that are unacceptable about Israel or about Jews. And so black politicians in the 1980s and 1990s were being asked to denounce the Reverend Louis Farrakhan, just as Hillary Clinton asked Barack Obama to denounce and repudiate his former minister's remarks. And people were reluctant to do so. And so, then you get all these stories about Louis Farrakhan, and anything he says becomes kind of news. And the fact that he's not marginalized by other mainstream elected official black politicians, the NAACP, the major spokespersons, who are afraid to lose the fealty of other black people or some other black people by seeming to be kowtowing to and catering to the, quote, white establishment by denouncing, quote, the brother, close quote, Louis Farrakhan. It gives him a lot more airtime and a lot more play than he deserves. And just to take this point to its fruition, if the extremes, say Tea Party right or say anti-war left in the Democratic Party, have outsized influence, that certainly undermines the more general capacity for there to be a deliberative politics that can strike compromise and negotiate a reasonable balance between the conflicting interests and opinions of the constituencies.
Right, and furthermore, we cannot really infer where people's opinions on a particular issue really lie, because they have been selectively silenced. Certain opinions have been selectively silenced. So what we see is a distribution of expression that may not match or reflect in any way the actual distribution of sentiment on a particular issue.
Yeah, that's a really important implication. That we kind of, we got chatter.
Yeah.
We what the ending, what ends up being publicly expressed is a very noisy signal about what people really think.
Right.
We end up with noise.
Right. And I want to move on to another point that you make in this paper, which to me is actually one of the most interesting, and it relates to the issue of tokenism. So, tokenism, loosely defined, would be, let's say, the inclusion of a very atypical member in a group where most folks are unlike this individual. So, for example, hiring a woman into a team, let's say, that consists entirely of men, or somebody who's black into an all-white organization, and so on.
Yeah.
And or political party, if you like, leadership in a political party, and this issue of tokenism is mocked, is often ridiculed, because the response is that, well, there's no substantive change; it's just a cosmetic change. But one of the very, very interesting insights in your paper is that these so-called tokens, the single woman in a group of men, the single black individual in a group of whites, can have a very, very dramatic impact on the nature of discourse within these groups. And once you think about it, it becomes obvious that there are things that a group of men might say when speaking about women, for instance, in a group which contains no women, relative to what they would say publicly in a group that contains even just one woman. It completely transforms the nature of the conversation, the dialogue, and the discourse. And it's interesting to think about the reasons for this.
Yes.
I mean, the most obvious reason is, well, that the men care about what the woman would think of them were they to express certain opinions. But in fact, even if they don't care, there might still be a very dramatic impact, because the other men in the group will treat a particular statement very differently, depending on whether it is said in the presence of a woman or not said in the presence of a woman. And the same, what you call the meaning in effect. I think you are drawing perhaps on Goffman here, but
I am.
but the same statement has a completely different meaning, even if there is just a single individual from outside of this group present when the discourse takes place. Could you expand on this maybe a little bit? Because I think...
Oh, yes, and again, thanks for inviting me to do so. I call it the chaperone effect. Okay, so this is the idea that I have a locker room conversation amongst a bunch of guys, but these guys happen to be sitting at the table in the boardroom. Okay, it's a locker room conversation, but they're in the boardroom because they're making some executive decision. They are a council or a panel of some responsible kind, and they're having deliberations, and it gets into a locker room conversation in which various kinds of stereotypes about women might be easily bandied about amongst the guys. There's no woman present. Now let there be one woman present. As you say, the direct effect of her presence will be that now people will have to consider that a woman is hearing me say this as well as that guys are hearing me say this. And maybe the sexual innuendo or the little snide, sarcastic, funny snicker won't go down so well with this woman, and I care about what she thinks about me. I don't want to offend her. She might be my boss one day or whatever. So I temper what I say. But that would not be the main channel of the effect, the so-called chaperone effect that I try to identify in this analysis. The main channel would be that the guy who's about to make this, dirty joke or this misogynistic sly comment, thinking that in the locker room he might be forgiven, knows that the other guys know that he was saying the thing that he said in front of this woman. He becomes the kind of guy who would say that in front of a woman. He becomes that not just to the woman, but to the other guys.
That's right.
So her entry into this otherwise cloistered council, tokenism, and perhaps dismissed, they've got their token woman and whatnot, but it really could be quite qualitatively significant in transforming the conversation, because it's not that she gives permission, but it's that the others will hold permission to talk in this way in her presence, the others being men, judging a guy not only by what he says in the locker room, but what we think he's willing to say in front of another woman, this kind of idea. So thanks for noticing that. That was something I was proud of from the analysis.
Yeah, that's so the implication is that small changes in the composition of a group, or even minuscule changes.
Notice, excuse me for interrupting, the implication that has for the diversity argument about affirmative action in higher education. And I don't have a brief here for the conventional classical. Yeah. And if we have time, we can talk more about affirmative action discourse as exemplifying the broader phenomenon of political correctness. But on this point, we teach undergraduates, you and I, you at Columbia, me at Brown. And we teach about race, you and I, and about inequality and whatnot. And we have students in our class that come from all over the world. They are extraordinary young people. And they talk. They read articles and books and research papers. They hear lectures. There's discussion. And what do they say to each other in these contexts? And how do they say it? How do they deliberate, as it were? And how would they deliberate about race in America, crime and punishment, affirmative action, overrepresentation of blacks in prisons, the continuing racial profiling, policing a city like New York, chokehold deaths, etc.? How would they talk about that? They come from Hong Kong, they come from Bangalore, they come from all over the world. In or not in the presence of other types of students, and what that class discussion looks like, and what the fact that student being present contributes. And so here the point would simply be the student will contribute a point of view, but the student will also, in his or her embodiment of identity, contribute a stage setting presence
Right.
which will alter the substance of the deliberation that goes on. And I'd be prepared to defend the idea that having, a few, you don't need very many, perhaps. That's a separate question. Students of color, as they say, African American, Latino, as they say, American students in an Ivy League classroom on race and inequality in America or even in global perspective would have this kind of pedagogic benefit of disciplining the discussion. Or is it a benefit? People might say, oh, that will only contribute to other students being afraid to express their point of view. We could have an interesting debate about that.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about this, actually, this effect is that, there's a great difference in the nature of discourse that would take place in a room. If a room containing, let's say, 9 men and a woman, if each of the 9 men knew that the women were present but believed that the others did not, compared to the case where it was common knowledge that the woman was present. So,
there's an experiment that you and I could actually run in a laboratory that could simulate precisely the alternative hypothetical where the men either know or don't know that the other men know that the woman is present.
Yeah.
That scenario, I mean, that could be experimentally implicated.
That's right.
Implemented.
That's right. But if the logic of your argument is right, that it's really, knowledge by the men of the presence of the woman is not all that's going on. It's knowledge that the others have the same knowledge, and so on up the hierarchy of beliefs. That really it is the fact that people, not only that people don't want to say something in the presence of a woman, but that they interpret something that somebody else has said, knowing that speaker is
Right.
aware that there is a woman present. The interpretation of that comment can be completely transformed, and I think this is an important effect, and it shows that what we often dismiss as tokenism may be a bit too easily dismissed. That its transformative impact may be vastly out of proportion with its effect on the composition of a group.
Indeed.
So, Glenn, there were a couple of other things that I thought I would ask you about, actually, about affirmative action and the classroom. So there's an interesting debate in the pages of the American Prospect, actually, stemming from a book by Cheryl Cashin, who's a law professor at Georgetown.
Yes.
And I got, since I knew we were going to have this conversation about your paper, I couldn't avoid reading this exchange between Cheryl Cashin and Richard Rothstein in the pages of the American Prospect, in light of your ideas. And basically, if I can just summarize, I haven't read her book. I've heard an interview with her on the radio, and I looked at Rothstein's review of it, and then the exchange between her and Richard Rothstein.
I have the book. I've not yet read it. I've seen some reviews of it.
It seems like it's worth reading, but if you'll allow me to describe my understanding of an argument without having read the book, it is that she believes that we ought to be basing admissions really on two criteria, not directly on the race of an applicant, but rather on the characteristics of the neighborhood where they live, such as the poverty rate in the neighborhood that they live, and family wealth. And she believes really that this will allow for a great deal of racial diversity on campuses, but not of the kind that we have had, where she argues that a lot of the beneficiaries of affirmative action have been, for instance, well-educated, fairly affluent migrants from Africa or the Caribbean. Yep. And she makes this argument, but Rothstein takes what I understand to be a more orthodox liberal position on this. They're both arguing, I think, from a liberal, from a liberal standpoint.
Right.
But is it the case that this is an example? So Cheryl Cashin's ability to put these ideas on the table is made easier by the fact that she has natural cover, or that she is standing to make these arguments, which may be harder within the population of liberals for a white liberal to make. Would you think that there's anything?
Okay, so now who was the guy at I think he's at USC Law School, who's had, what is his name? He's a lawyer who did a study of the effects of affirmative action in legal education.
Is it Sander or is it UCLA?
Yeah, Richard Sander.
Yeah, that's UCLA.
Okay, so he's a white male.
Yes.
So he's not making the same argument as Cheryl Cashin, who is African American, who's also a lawyer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
He's not making quite the same argument as is she, but he's arguing against conventional affirmative action. He's saying class, not race. So I think he would have it entirely about wealth or entirely about wealth and income, and says, some blacks would be brought in because blacks are overrepresented relative to population amongst lower class people. So if you have a class-based system. But in any case, he gets a lot of flack, and perhaps she's having a different reception for her argument about place, not race.
Which is quite different. The two arguments are quite different. But
these are very different arguments. So the arguments are different, but they're both moving away from conventional affirmative action. And you ask me whether or not she mightn't be an example of natural cover because of the fact that she's black, she's more able to make a critical argument about conventional affirmative action without being thought to be anti-black.
Right.
And I think that that's probably true. And I just want to make a couple of quick observations. One of them is that while Richard Sander and Cheryl Cashin are not making at all the same arguments, both of their arguments are understandable within a broader framework, which is to say, if we're going to do affirmative action, what should the criteria for its application be? And whereas a simple racial category which is our historical inheritance and which has been very widely disputed and been the subject of deliberation in the Supreme Court and so forth as to its constitutionality, is one way to go. Blacks or blacks and Latinos or blacks, Latinos and women or whatever is one way to go. And then you're just very broad. And within that, the people who are going to benefit are going to be the wealthier blacks, or they're going to be the quote unquote blacks who are African second generation immigrants from families that are prosperous and well educated and secure, because they'll do best on the test and they'll be the ones that the Ivies want to invite. And so it's poorly targeted within blacks, this generic thing. And so we could look for other ways of doing it. And then you could also have a principled argument, which is we shouldn't be doing it by race, that's a kind of constitutionally suspect and morally suspect mode of categorization, and that some of these others are more defensible in terms of first principles. And there are many ways that one can do affirmative action. You can think about a very general framework, and then you can always back out. The general framework would be I give preference based upon a wide range of criteria, and those criteria could include the zip code that you are living in and the level of, the percentage of students at your high school who were eligible for free or subsidized lunches. They could be your family's wealth. There could be various other kinds of measures, and we could think of many of them. Family structure, and other kinds of things. If there was a dad at home the whole time, that's one thing. If not there, it's a different thing. We could categorize people in many different ways, and then we could put weight on these various dimensions of their categorization other than race. And then you could always ask, well, how will that do as a substitute for explicitly racial affirmative action? Anyway, I have gone on again too long to say that terrain of debate about how to modify or implement affirmative action is fraught. It has been for a long time with, taboos and with the, you're either for it against this kind of black and white way of seeing the world. And someone who is black has a little bit more freedom to maneuver. There are other people, myself, in my history as a critic of affirmative action, Randall Kennedy, the law professor at Harvard, whose work on affirmative action has been nuanced and somewhat more controversial than perhaps a white law professor would be willing to endure, because they wouldn't want to be thought to be, on the wrong side of that moral.
This goes back to our starting point, which is that people are communicating not just their opinions about things, but also indirectly their values and deep moral commitments, and this can cause dialogue to be distorted in interesting and sometimes very harmful ways.
But as we've gone on, and I know we're going to have to wind this conversation down soon, I didn't want to overlook, or perhaps I should invite you to frame the kind of, okay, if you have one of these equilibria, how do you get out of it? The dilemma we have this idea in economics, the prisoner's dilemma, the bad equilibrium, the tragedy of the commons, where no individual sees an incentive at acting differently from a pattern of behavior which, when implemented by every individual, leads to their ruin. And we kind of have a dilemma. And people, students of, social organization and social action, have argued against this idea that it's a no way out cul-de-sac of rational tragedy that no individual will act. And they find ways of self-organizing reform and whatnot. I associate Elinor Ostrom somehow with this idea that communities can solve collective action dilemmas in creative ways through developing relationship and becoming accountable to one another in different kind of ways. And that kind of problem, the problem of how to get out of the bad equilibrium where no one is willing to say that the emperor has no clothes, arises here. And I conclude my paper, I'll stop with the sentence, by observing that it may be that the behavior of individuals that are kind of irrational or transrational, they've made the calculation and they know that to speak is likely to generate misery for themselves. But nevertheless, they're married to the idea of truth, and they're going to be truth-telling, heroic martyrs in the face of political correctness and censorship. But they're going to live and express the truth. I was so inspired by Václav Havel's writing about the role of the dissident in Eastern Europe back in the communist repressive era in Eastern Europe, where these people in their Samizdat publications and criticisms were speaking out on behalf of what they understood to be truth. And I thought this idea, heroic behavior on behalf of truth as an existential imperative, regardless of the consequence, warranted to be underlined.
Yeah. That's one possibility. If enough people set aside, just are willing to disregard how the world will view them, what the world will infer about their deeper moral commitments, and just simply say things as they see them, that could be transformative. But of course, you need a critical mass. You need large enough number. Otherwise, the equilibrium continues to have its hold. And one of the examples you use in the paper, the speech of, from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Brutus makes a speech that you describe as naive, guileless, and literal. He explains precisely why, Caesar had to go, that he was an ambitious man, and so on. And it's both spoken and received very, very literally. And then Mark Antony gets up and makes a speech that is anything but literal, where he sometimes says the opposite of exactly what he means, and it's politically far more effective. And one way to express what you have just said is that we need a lot. We need some people, either through the courage of their convictions or for some other reason, to actually behave in a way which is guileless, which is in some respects naive, or maybe not naive, maybe sophisticated, but still with a willingness to disregard what inferences would be made about their deep commitments. And this is possibly one way to move to an equilibrium with a richer public discourse.
Well, I so love that you recall the quotes from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Act 3, he's been murdered. I mean, I love it because, of course, it's a work of genius, this dramatic tragedy of Shakespeare's. And it's political genius as well as literary genius, I think. And yes, precisely the scene is, Brutus's line is, not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more.
Yes.
And Mark Antony's line is, Brutus says Caesar was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man.
Yes.
Brutus is saying Caesar was trying to become king, and we had to stop him on behalf of the Republic. It's a very straightforward and logical argument.
Yeah.
He is, as a matter of fact, an honorable man. Yeah. But Antony is saying, this guy is a traitor who murdered our king.
That's right.
And we need to run him out of town on the rail. But he never says that. He says just the opposite of that. And of course, he gets the better of the argument.
He
precisely. Does. Brutus is naive. Anthony is strategic,
right.
And effective political speech has to be strategic.
That's right. But yet we have this dilemma where you need a critical mass of people to refuse to be strategic. Otherwise, you cannot move to superior equilibrium or equilibrium with more vibrant public discourse. So
well, that's the economist's observation. Yeah. Quite right.
So that do you think this seems like a natural stopping point? We've been talking for about an hour.
I would say so. We've been talking for about an hour. I think we've got, and so I thank you so much for giving your time, for doing this for Blogging Heads and the Glenn Show, but also for your careful attention to my 20-year-old paper, of which I'm very proud. And to the audience, if you've sat through this whole thing. But I mean, the idea here would be, I think, Rajiv, that, and then you and I will be having other conversations, I'm sure, about economics and social life and things, that it's possible for us to be both academic specialists, but also intellectuals broadly engaged with social questions of interest to other informed people.
Mm-hmm.
And these conversations shouldn't only be in seminar rooms or shrouded in mathematical obscurantism. They should be open and accessible to a broadly educated public.
Yes, of course. I agree, Glenn.
Again, thanks a lot. Okay, so we'll sign off, and until next time, great talking to you.
Okay, bye-bye, Glenn.